Good morning there, my friends, fellow gamers, gamer gurus, what have yous, who force, and so on and so forth. See if I can get out of the driveway here. All this heavy rain and snow has kind of turned it to quicksand in some spots. There we go. Trying not to tear it up any worse than it already is. Anyhow, I did a video here this past week, for the video response channel that I'm a member of, on the subject of non-player characters or NPCs. And there's a lot of debate, or not some opinion. There's a lot of opinion on just how effective or just how useful NPCs are, what their purpose is, blah, blah, blah. And of course, I, the fat man, have opinions on this. 40 odd years, that's 4 decades of utilizing NPCs of all sorts of types at all levels for all kinds of purposes have given me just a hair bit of an insight on this topic. And I thought I'd like to share this with my YouTube channel. And so this will be a variant of the topic that I've done for the VR channel. Our first basic NPC is not unlike what you see on TV or in the movies, but basically extra walk-ons, backstop flavor. These are just bodies, images of people sitting in the background or moving up and down the street, basically giving life to the situation. Now, more often do you see non-player characters. It's usually in a setting or a village or town, maybe once in a blue moon while you're traveling across the country on your way to an adventure site. They'll encounter the lone farmer or a merchant or something like this. But for the most part, these are just fluff, filler. They serve only one purpose, and that is to give additional life to your scene. So, you go into as I said, a monk, a jester, and a priest a monk, a jester, and a bard walk into a tavern, and blah. So in the background, you've got a half dozen, multiple dozens of NPCs. And at the end of the day, we don't care a lick about these. We don't need any stats. We don't need any basic information on them other than perhaps, their sex or their race, if that's important to you. Obviously, if you walk into a drow tavern, you probably want to have a bunch of drow populating the background. They don't have to be all drow, but you know what I mean. So that's it. There's no more additional information necessary. And there's no more additional information necessary to be conveyed to your characters or your players, because that's all it is. They're going to see them and immediately dismiss them. So if your characters get into a brawl, these are the ones that are more likely going to dive out the window, jump through the door, throw themselves under a table, etc. Number two are, bit actors. These are non-player characters, in my opinion, that do serve a purpose. And thus, we might need a little more information than we did with the number 1 category. So if your characters walk into a tavern and they talk to the barkeep, for example, or they go to a merchant or into a shop and talk to a clerk or a merchant or somebody who they're going to interact with. So, what do we need to know about these particular category of non-player characters? Gotta love the potholes. They still fixed them, but they're just as rough as they were before. The idea, well, what their purpose is, i.e. the merchant, the bartender, the barkeep, the local town guard, or what have you. Perhaps we need to know the basic class. Now, there's some debate about whether or not you need to really care about that. Well, usually their name kind of says it all. So in the case of a merchant, he's a merchant. I mean, these are technically secondary classes if you want to look it up in Dungeons and Dragons anyway. You can look it up in the DM guide. But the fact of it is, most of them are commoners. The occasional warrior trained fighter, i.e. the city guard, for example. But what do they do is usually what they're titled as, i.e. the tavern keeper, the bar, the merchant, etc. So we may need to have a base skill and or a stat that feeds that skill. So if the particulars in this case would be that our bartender, for example, may need to have a little bit of negotiating skill, or may need to have a little bit of interaction skill. So we're going to interact with the player. We want to have an idea, and you can always go and fudge. The GM has that prerogative to just basically say, okay, the base is is 10, so beat a 10, for example, and you're successful. If you're trying to apply the bartender for information, he's going to have a 10. Maybe his is a 15, depending on the detail or the type of information your characters are fishing for. If it's the sort of thing that's not likely to be known by this fella, then you can flat out say that, or you can have it, a D20, for example. It's not however you want to look at it, but in my experience, generally speaking, I have slews and I've got a horde of already pre-generated non-player characters in a lot of different game material, and in a lot of cases, they're just huge categories of them. So I can pick one at random on the fly. Now, there's a chance that this particular character is going to come back around, that they're going to be a reoccurring non-player character, which is a different twisted subject. And I want to dock on that, but I'm not going to do it in this video. I'm going to do a different video on my opinions and experiences with utilizing non-player characters on a semi or regular basis. So in this case, having a notebook handy and jotting down the name of the bartender and the basic whatever stat you needed to have at that moment for this particular establishment might be useful if the odds are your characters are going to come back to this same location. And that's not unheard of or impossible if they're operating in a small sandbox, if you will, a small environment that you've concocted or that you're running out of a module. Having that basic information available is pertinent and possibly useful. So it's a continuity, I cannot pronounce that word. So it's taken me a lot of times to try it. But we want everything to be consistent. The McDonald's effect. No matter where in the world you go, when you step into a McDonald's, you're going to find the basic Big Mac and quarter pounder and fries. It doesn't matter what their local customs are, the odds are you're going to find those. And if you're not, you are in a very unique location. Anyhow, so our third category of non-player character is one that sometimes really kind of can be a confusing option. This is something that not all players seem to be able to grasp or handle very well. And I've had a lot of players and some very experienced ones tell me, oh, sure, we get it. And then they don't, right? They don't. You have a certain category of non-player character that fits a very detailed role in some environments, especially if you're operating in places like your adventure set in a urban setting of any sort. You're going to have a lot more recurring characters. These are these secondary characters or supporting actors that you see in your books, your novels, your TV series, your movies, so on and so forth. These have speaking. These are non-player characters with speaking parts and potentially important roles to play. So if your character has a mentor, for example, if your wizard is a young, level-wise, and has just finished their apprenticeship or is big blah blah blah, and they have this mentor or this teacher, this sensei that they have as part of their backstory connections. Well, if they interact with this individual on any situation, any level, we need to have a bit more information about this non-player character. As the GM, it's to your advantage to keep a little bit more detailed information, a running log, or maybe a file in your computer somewhere that you can access, because if there's a chance, even a modest chance, that character is going to have a conversation with this person on more than one occasion, having a detailed set of, having it consistent is desirable, in my humble opinion, or not so humble opinion, depending how you look at it. And Why would you want to know? Well, what would you want to know? Well, for starters, we need to know what class they are, what level they are. Ideally, if they're a teacher or a mentor, they're going to be at least significant, 2, 3, 4 levels higher than the character. Otherwise, how could they have passed on anything worthwhile? We're going to want to know their basic stats. We're going to want to know most of the skills that are related to those stats that are pertinent to their class. So you're going to have an abridged version of a player character sheet in this case. It's not necessary to have all the stats and all the information. And some of that, especially at the beginning, if this is just, on initial communication, for example, and maybe I'm using a poor analogy, a poor example, so I'm going to switch to a slightly different. This is the same third-tiered or third category non-player character. This is somebody that your characters are interacting with. Perhaps they are somebody who has employed them, hired them, or is a senior chief lieutenant or flunky of something in the city or in the environment that they're going to need to interact with on more than one occasion. And I've used these to great success. And one of the things I've always liked about them is the bringing them along. So if the characters transfer, they go from one adventure to the next, and they're still in the same region, well, why not utilize the same non-player characters, as long as, of course, they didn't get wiped out or something in the earlier encounters, and utilize this, once again, the familiarity of the McDonald's effect. There's value in, I don't want to say conformity, but consistency and all right, guys, let me over. I'm coming over, dude. It's called a turn signal. I always love that, folks. When you're driving down the road and you're in traffic, somebody's got a turn signal on, acknowledge the fact that it is a turn signal, and it's not your job to rush up there and try to prevent that person from switching lanes, especially if they're driving a big, greasy, old-looking piece of POS. I'm just saying, there's a reason this truck's covered in dents and dings, and it ain't necessarily because I drive into stuff, but somebody else has, I guarantee it. Anyway, so this non-player character, perhaps in my using my play-by-post campaign as a current example, there's several important non-player characters who serve as handlers or contacts for various characters. And in one case, one character's mentor may be an employer or a handler in another. So I'm doubling down. I'm killing two birds with one stone, and in doing so, I need a little bit more information. I need a much more detailed non-player character. So not only do I know this character's class level, I know their profession. I know some backstory about them. I know what they do for a living. I know who they answer to in this particular case. I know their basic stats because it was important on one or two encounters to have them have a counter roll versus something that the player was doing, the character was doing. So as I go, this non-player character is developing more and more depth, and I'm adding and expanding on the character's creation to do just that, which is kind of what we want to do here. And if something happens to the character, then so be it. But that would also entail having their combat capabilities, in this case, if nothing else, their armor class and hit points in case they're attacked and they need to defend themselves, or somehow or another the characters eliminate them, or an opposing NPC eliminates them. That is another layer or level of interaction that I'm saving for this other video, what I probably will do later today. This category 3 NPC, of course, is probably the second most common NPC that you encounter in a given game on a regular basis. So you've all had these. This is that, like I said, this cheap person that your player characters have gone back to for information, or have brought things to, or taken jobs from, or have interacted with. Some of our bad guys. Matter of fact, most of our bad guys fit into this category. These are the ones where you really kind of want to have them flushed out a little bit in advance if they're going to be pertinent right away. If not, leave plenty of room to do just that, to add to them. And I love these roads. I should have turned somewhere else. There's a road down here that's still partially flooded out, so I have to divert around it. So in the proper case of having set that up in advance, makes it easier to deal with on a case-by-case situation. That's not always the way it works out, but generally, in my experience, it happens far more frequently than most people like to acknowledge. So once we've established the third category of character, good morning, my viewer, whomever you may be. It's rare to get a viewer on my YouTube stuff when I'm doing a live thing, but hey, it's always great to have company. The fourth tier, or fourth category of non-player character, is also probably a very misunderstood non-player character. I have seen a lot of discussion and opinions on this particular category. This is, for the lack of a better word, the backup or the substitute or the filler non-player character for any group. Potentially, they're meat shields, they're portable medical facilities, maybe a second level of protection, what have you. In some cases, certain character classes develop followers and people who will serve as guards for the camp, for the animals, and we call these things NPCs as well. Sometimes they're also used as a pool of replacements for characters. So if you're in a particularly lethal campaign where characters are dropping left and right, or even a handful of them drop, which is becoming more rare. From when I listen to other people talk, if you look at a lot of the current game systems today, they've pretty much made it very hard to truly make a lethal game. Not that you go out of your way to create a lethal game, but the chance of death is becoming harder and less frequent, less likely, because there's so many buyouts. There's so many ways to avoid having that situation happen. Anyway, so, and here's the most common scenario in my experience, where you would have this number 4 category of NPC, is when you as a GM have a couple regular players show up at the table, but you need more bodies. You don't have a complete adventuring group, or your adventuring group is not sufficiently powerful to handle whatever it is you plan for them. So in the past, where I've had 1 or 2 or in some cases 3 players, and I felt I needed to have an extra couple characters, or we're missing a key piece. So if your players come up with a good combination that they're lacking, let's say the cleric, which is also usually the most commonly absent player. Not everybody wants to play that cleric role, especially back in the day, because it was just considered an over-glorified healer, an over-glorified medic. And without the medic, your campaign can get short, especially in earlier ages, when you don't have a lot of resources to purchase potions of healing. That always amuses me in some campaigns, where it just seems like you can walk into a store and here's an entire shelf full of healing potions and cure disease, and basically it's Costco medieval style, and all you need is the coin to purchase as much as you want. And while that's conducive and fun in some environments, it's also not exactly, I don't know, realistic. If you're looking for a little bit more depth to a game, that's kind of a cheat, in my opinion. But that NPC is still, that character class is still important. So we often fill in with an NPC. So in this case, we're going to need everything. You're going to treat that non-player character as if he's a character or she is a character, and you're going to fully flush them out from the very beginning. You're going to have to do a little resource management. You're going to have some accounting. Whether you, the GM, does it or you, the player, does it for the GM, somebody's got to keep track of that particular NPC or the extra NPCs that you've included in your group. So in this case, if we choose to have an NPC cleric, we need to have as much information on that cleric as pertinent, the same information that your player character would have, and they're going to also gain experience through actions. So if they're part of the adventuring group, just like I said, whether a GM is going to add voice to the non-player character, and I've got mixed opinions on this. I have done both, and I've done both quite frequently. I have played the non-player character for the group as if I'm another player, and yet still trying to be the GM at the same time. It can be a bit of a challenge. Or I just another player to ghost that character. Therein lies another rub. Sometimes those characters, the player running the character just treats them as a meat shield or as a tool, and it really doesn't do that much effort into bringing life to that non-player character because they're more concerned about their personal character for, understandable reasons. But that's your two options. So somebody has to do the resource management. Somebody has to maintain them. If they take damage, chalk off the damage points, and then get healed, add them up, blah, 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 level them up, etc., etc. So even within that fourth category, fourth tier of non-player character, you technically got at least two different sub-tiers. Like I said, the first tier, of course, is the non-player player character. And that only in the games, right? Only role playing, where we can have a non-player character who's a supporting actor role for our campaign and for our adventure, and they're important, and they need to be managed just like somebody would manage their own character. Then there's the second tier version. Now these are the ones, like I said, if you get minions or followers, camp followers, a number of leadership feats and skills in the past, paladins, certain fighter classes, things like this, attract followers and minions and lackeys and so on and so forth. Now, if you're going to utilize these and you're not just sending them home to look after your farm and family or look after the castle or what have you, you're going to need to do a little resource management. At that point, I leave that up to the player. Player wants to collect an entourage, then it's the player's responsibility to manage that entourage and keep an eye on them. It's just my responsibility as the GM to occasionally test that entourage in some way when things are slow. So, meanwhile, back at the camp, kind of thing, right? See what's going on. That way your non-player character entourage is also gaining a little bit of experience and effort to grow and develop, so on and so forth. Ooh, at least I fixed this one a little bit. And there's my first job of the morning. Nice little restaurant called Francine's. I have a very weird day today. I'm not happy with it. I don't like Fridays that work out like this. But I am working off and on all day and into the evening. And if my boss would have it, I'd be out all night. But I'm going to fudge and start working on this one job all through the day so I don't have to stay out all night. Plus it's payday and I need to take the wife to the store and the bank because she gets gripey if I don't. So on and so forth. So there's the four categories of non-player character. And like I said here a little later, I'm going to do another video on how I see them being utilized or how I like to utilize them. And sometimes it surprises people or annoys players, depending on the player itself, of just how much depth and effort I put into my non-player characters to bring life to the campaign, because they're such an integral, important part of the game world that we're trying to create, in my humble opinion. Thank you, viewer, for sticking with me through this, and just remember, everybody, keep your non-player characters handy.